Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we are going to run through some news stories which have been coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm the solicitor and managing director at Digital Law, and we've got some interesting news stories to look at this week. It's been a busy week, lots of I'd say novel things happening, including a fairly interesting decision coming out from the UK Supreme Court. So I will pass back to Amelia to take us through it.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story today is to do with the electronic monitoring of home workers by companies. So this is where people have been working from home and companies have been monitoring what they've been doing. And in this particular story, we hear from Chris in Sheffield, who was an engineer, and he was working from home using his private computer, not even a work computer. And he found that when he went into the office, lots of screens had been switched on and you could see everyone's desktops, irrelevant whether they were work laptops or private laptops. And I mean, the trade union Prospect is calling for stronger regulations of the use of monitoring technology by employers. And 32% of home workers are now being monitored by their firms, which is up 24% from April. And so, I mean, this is complete madness. I'll pass over to Peter to continue kind of talking through this.
Thank you, Amelia, for telling us what you think there.
Yes.
It's a very interesting story. Surveillance by companies of employees is not a new thing. Indeed, surveillance even in the office, in the workplace, was becoming an issue even before the pandemic came along. Some banks were being penalised or being told to remove equipment that, for example, monitored how long people spent away from their desks, or monitored whether they may be falling asleep at the desk. Different things like that have been trialled and then found to be not entirely in keeping with workplace, not to mention, well, workplace health and safety and privacy. In this instance, we've now got an individual talking about going into the office and finding that the business networks that were in the office were then being used to employees were working at home using their own personal devices, laptops, desktops, etc., and then logging onto the work machines. And in this instance, the work machines were then echoing and duplicating the desktop that the individual has open at home. So if the individual at home is using, say, YouTube, browsing, internet shopping, that would show up in the office. So managers would see everything that was going on. I think you only have to think about the fact that an awful lot of people have been homeschooling children for the best part of 18 months to think about the implications of, well, what if other people are going on to what is a personal machine? Don't forget that we've got individuals here who, as I say, it's personal machines, not that they've been given a laptop or whatever by the employer and being told to use that at home. So where it's a personal device, and then it could be shared with a partner, a spouse, children, other people in the house. I think there's massive implications there, just generally with regards to privacy, in particular now that we're in a world where everything has to be accessed online, everything from your internet banking to making GP appointments, ordering the shopping. We are more reliant on using our internet connections than ever before, and the idea of this being looked at by an employer is a little bit creepy 1984-ish, Orwellian as a result. There are laws on this sort of stuff, and one issue that we've come across in the past was where people's business email inboxes might be looked at by the employer, and it turns out that your business email, while it is provided by the employer, that is generally held to be yours, because you will be using it for anything from contacting people, generating business, working on business, speaking to clients, but you might also be speaking to family, friends. You could be, for example, taking care of custody arrangements for children, various different things. So your employer doesn't have an automatic right to snoop in that inbox. They can look without an employee's permission if they have suspicion of, say, having their fingers in the till, so fraud, something like that. But even then, it has to be for a specific time-limited period. An employer can't open-ended just take a look in an employee's email inbox. And in this instance, we're now looking here at employers having unfettered access to an employee's desktop on their home working device. And that's where we are sort of seeing a line being crossed. And that statistic, Amelia, that you gave us from the trade union, a third of employees are under some form of surveillance while working from home. So I think it's a matter really of some of the practices here that are evolving, perhaps having to catch up with actually what the law already says in terms of what is and is not permissible. It's also, I think, problematic where you've got people using their own personal equipment at home and having to be using that for business purposes, where you've then got the employer saying, right, you're going to use this to carry out work, even if in this instance you're joining the office network. It's the idea of that personal device being under surveillance by the employer, I think, is going to be problematic for an employer to justify as well. So quite a lot to unpack from there as a result.
Yeah, and as well, part of this is under the same kind of survey. The union has launched a new sector to recruit tech workers, and the proportion of people being monitored at home by camera has also more than doubled from April. So that's from 5% up to 13%, which, like, going back to what you say, is very Orwellian.
Indeed. So more than 1 in 10 people finding that their webcam is being used, and they might not even be aware of it. It really is the idea of Big Brother is watching you all the time, and I'd be worried that certain employees might not even have picked up on that fact.
Yeah, exactly. And linking to this story very closely is a story that came out a couple of days ago from Portugal. So Portugal has banned employers from contacting workers outside of office hours. Now, this is very interesting in regards to our previous story where we just talked about people working from home and the surveillance. So in Portugal, they have approved a new law banning employers contacting workers outside of office hours, and companies will face fines if they email after the working day has ended. And this comes as a direct impact from the increase in working from home since the pandemic. It's also quite interesting to note companies will help to pay workers' expenses incurred as a result from working from home. So that's kind of electricity and internet bills, and it'll be written off as a business expense. So I'll pass over to Peter to go through the rest of this bit.
Thanks, Amelia. It's interesting that Portugal has chosen to be a real leader here in passing this law, and it will be interesting to see if over time we get any similar laws coming in at an EU level potentially. The idea of having this sort of enshrined is interesting. That there have been, I think, other EU countries that have looked at this in terms of, for example, having email service switched off at weekends and evenings, and that is indeed the sort of thing that an employer will be likely to do here, given that otherwise they could be fined if emails are being sent to staff outside of office hours and staff are feeling obliged to then check on their devices or logging in via remote access to pick up emails outside of the contracted working hours. And it's become pervasive over the last couple of decades, the idea of sort of being always on, the idea of the notification on a business, what used to be a business BlackBerry and now business mobile phone, that notification and you feeling, oh, I need to just check this and just see what's happening. To the point that now quite often people, even if it is their own personal holiday time, are then still checking phones and answering emails. And this is an attempt by Portugal to sort of redress the balance and say that no, free time, it should be genuinely free time. It will be interesting to see, as I say, if it comes at an EU level there, anyone though rubbing their hands and thinking, great, I'm going to stop being mithered by my employer via email outside of working hours in the UK might be waiting rather a long time for something to happen there, because I can't see the business lobbies, the Confederation of British Industry and others, I can't see them madly pushing for and endorsing that sort of legislation in the UK, but I may be wrong. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see what happens from this one, because I mean, we've all experienced the working from home, and I think some people might say that actually going back into the office has helped them become more productive and help them kind of address that work-life balance, because they are kind of going back into the office, which is an interesting part of the story as well, because alongside not being bothered outside of office hours, they've also been given the right to work from home until their child turns 8, as long as they've arranged it in advance with their employers. So this too kind of goes back to that idea that there is that kind of redressing the balance.
Yes, and sort of having that right to work from home if you ask for it I've seen a lot of news around that, and increasingly we're seeing it almost sort of becoming enshrined as a general right. But it's interesting, at the same time that people are sort of embracing the idea to, look, you've let me work from home during the pandemic, I'd like to maintain that right for a few days a week now as the economy opens back up, is clearly popular. And clearly we know that work from home was very popular for a lot of those who I think were finding the commute was more of a barrier to actually getting work done than might otherwise have been the case. At the same time, I've seen a lot of articles over the last few weeks saying, oh, you can't expect to develop your career and move on if you're always working from home. So there seems to be a sort of a drumbeat from certain quarters saying, if you want to still be sort of climbing and ascending the greasy pole and looking for promotion and salary rises and advancement, there is now a sort of drumbeat that says, well, you still need to be in the office in order to do that. But, you know, there's a certain proportion of the workforce that really couldn't care less about those things. You know, you're simply be turning up to get the salary, and if it's easier to then do that from home, particularly if you might be you might have childcare commitments, you might be caring for an elderly family member or something. If you're just doing the job to pay the bills, and doing that job working from home a few days a week is going to be infinitely more appealing than the culture of presenteeism and the jacket on the chair over back at the office that still permeates in some parts of the economy. And I must say, in certain sectors, I mean, I can't imagine financial services, law and accounting necessarily wanting to have their staff working from home on a wide basis. But I may be wrong there. Let's see. There's certainly, I think, been a change in working practices and people's desires when it comes to how they're going to work over the course of the last 2 years. But will this be a brief sort of gap in the clouds and then we go back to the majority of people working in the office, or will there be a lasting change? And that's one of the things we'll see over the course of the next 12 months.
Certainly, and I think we are still in that kind of level of limbo where some, you know, even if we're looking wider than the UK, there are places that are kind of going back into lockdown that I've been reading in the news this week. In specifically, there have been a lot of other changes where there is still a lot of uncertainty as to whether people are still going to be office-based or still working from home.
Exactly.
So our next story for this week is the Supreme Court case that Peter mentioned earlier. So the UK Supreme Court has rejected a claim that sought billions of pounds in damages from Google over alleged illegal tracking of millions of iPhones. So the judges said that the claimant had failed to prove damage had been caused to individuals by the data collection. This is Britain's first data protection class action hit that's hit buffers, and the UK Supreme Court unanimously has allowed Google's appeal. I'll pass over to Peter to kind of chat through kind of what's going to happen with this one.
Yeah, thanks, Amelia. So just for those who are sort of looking at the detail here, because there have been several potential class actions chugging their way through the courts. This is the case led by Mr. Richard Lloyd, who was a consumer rights activist and former director of Which, and the claim related to data allegedly taken by Google relating to 5 million Apple iPhone users' personal data between 2011 and 2012, whereby default privacy settings on Safari would have been used to sort of track browser histories, were abstracted by Google and used for commercial purposes. i.e., if you've got 5 million people's analytic information in terms of what they've been searching for, what they're looking at online, that's pretty powerful from a marketing perspective. One of the key takeaways here, of course, is that this dates to a event between 2011 and 2012. So I was talking about a class action being made under the old Data Protection Act 1998, which in turn is based on the old EU Data Protection Directive from 1995. So this is old law that it's being based on here, not the new regulatory framework introduced by GDPR in 2018. So that's the basis upon which the class action has been going forward. They've been looking to be able to make a claim in relation to all of the affected data subjects, so those 5 million iPhone users. Under the Google and Vidal Hall case, the principle was put in place that individual data subjects could potentially claim for damages, whether they could prove they had sustained a loss or not. And that's the basis here that this class action would have been rolling forward. Interesting it's taken this long to be able to get its way through the Supreme Court to eventually get a decision. UK has, of course, left the European Union, so this is the end of the line as far as a UK class action is concerned. So you can't appeal to the European Court of Justice. It no longer has any jurisdiction in the United Kingdom. So the Supreme Court's word is indeed the final instance as far as UK law is concerned. So as you can imagine, there's been a bit of a sigh of relief from, I think, a number of bigger business organizations. So the CBI has turned around and said that if this claim had been allowed, this class action, you may have seen a bit of a chill on investment and an impact on the use of technology and innovation as a whole across the UK economy. So, and also there have been other class actions in relation to other uses of data that have been making their way through the system as well. I'd say if I was still looking to pursue a class action in a similar way based on the old pre-2018 law, I'd now be looking at that very, very carefully. The different issues behind and causes of action behind a claim, of course, are always going to be different, but there are some key principles here that the court has made clear. And they've made it quite clear that they do not feel that just because a loss of control has been sustained to personal data by a data subject, that isn't in of itself sufficient basis to then have a collective action for compensation, appears to be the outcome of this. So are we going to get continuing attempts to litigate over the back of data protection breaches? I think yes. But that's going to be where you can prove you've got a loss. So, for example, if your data was breached and then you're on the receiving end of credit card fraud, you've got a loss that you can point to. But if you can't point to a loss, I think that's therefore a bit more difficult. But also, I think it would be potentially easier to establish a cause of action for a class action under GDPR and UK DPA 2018. So you might see that someone might have a similar shot at establishing a class action like this under the post-2018 laws, and that'll be the thing we're going to have to wait for. But as I say, it's taken 10 years from when this incident happened to get this decision, so we might be looking at the middle of the decade before we find out if the regulatory settlement for data protection from 2018 onwards makes any difference in terms of how the courts would view a class action.
Exactly, and like you say, it's been a long time coming and going up through the courts. The court system does take a very long time, and the chance of kind of seeing anything similar to this caliber coming up until the middle of the decade is quite slim. So, and
the thing is as well, you've also got to bear in mind that when you've got these big cases, there has to be someone funding it in the first place. And if you've just seen this one hit the buffers after all these years, and you're thinking, oh, should we be writing more checks for another class actions? Even if it's an insurer that's backing this, they'd be looking and thinking, oh, well, if that's hit the buffers on that, should we be necessarily paying for something, even if it's under the new post-2018 settlement? You might look and think, well, the underlying principles here are unlikely to make the court reach a different verdict. So, and in particular, when very often these class action funders are operating on the basis of different algorithms, looking at previous cases, I say this case would have a fairly big impact on that, the way that algorithm might work. So yeah, a lot of implications for those nascent data protection group actions that have been building out there.
Okay, so moving on to our last story. This is concerning the 5 ransomware arrests. So these arrests have been connected to the ransomware gang Are Evil, and they have been arrested after an investigation in 17 countries, including the UK and the US. So this gang have been considered one of the most dangerous ransomware gangs in the world, and they have been responsible for many cyber attacks on companies, ranging from the foreign exchange provider Travelex to the world's biggest meat processor, JBS. So I'll pass on to Peter to kind of talk to you briefly about kind of what's been happening here.
Yeah, thanks, Emil. I think the main thing to take away here is that law enforcement is trying to follow up on those behind these ransomware attacks and wider cybercrime. And in this instance, it's led to some arrests, which is a good thing. But when we look at the sheer volume of ransomware and cybercrime as a whole, this still represents only a very small proportion of the perpetrators who are being caught up with. And it's an attempt to sort of show that if you are engaged in this to a significant level, I think there is still less risk to you personally as a cyber criminal engaging in this than, say, if you're engaged in more traditional forms of theft, like holding up bags with a sawn-off shotgun. You know, you've got people sat in high security prisons on life sentences doing 30 years for more traditional theft in the real world, where they may have been able to try to get hold of a few £1 million cash, whereas you've got hackers who are making millions, tens of millions, or even more, hundreds of millions from cyber crime. And very often they're simply beyond the reach of law enforcement. It is good in this instance that we appear to have an example of cross-jurisdictional law enforcement. It seems to be the UK working with the US and then with law enforcement on the ground in Europe to carry out these arrests. And it's through that sort of cooperation at a supranational level that is the only way you're going to be able very often to pursue these cyber criminals, because they're deliberately carrying out attacks in other countries because they know more often than not that national law enforcement simply does not have the teeth or the resources and willpower to pursue them. So it's a good example here that at least this has happened, and it has happened with a high-profile hacker collective. But it's we need to see more of it ultimately, because at the moment we have almost a pandemic of cybercrime, fraud, ransomware taking place. You know, something like 45 million people in the UK have been on the receiving end of a cyber scam of some sort over the course of the last year, and very often this stuff is being carried out with total impunity. So great to see this enforcement. Let's see some more of it.
Well, it's like you say, building on that, Peter, it's claimed that the people that were arrested were responsible for £5,000 worth of cyber attacks, whereas, like you're saying, there are far bigger fish to fry out there. This is kind of just a drop in the ocean of arrests that have occurred.
Indeed, you almost tend to think that the people that have been caught clearly weren't very good at it if they had only made £500,000 out of it.
Yeah.
I mean, we've heard of one public sector body in the UK that I think they were hit by ransomware 15 times and they kept paying up over the course of a year and paying the ransomware rather than actually having the proper cybersecurity measures put in place. And of course, the hackers are thinking, great, we've got a live one here, keep on locking them down, they'll pay the ransom, it comes back online, and then we hit them again and they pay. And you know, this must have had the flattest learning curve in history, because they kept on doing the same thing and expecting a different result. So the hackers were making huge amounts there, quite clearly. And you know, it's very often a ransom that's then paid in Bitcoin, which is virtually impossible to trace after it's left an individual's account. And this is part of the problem. So, like I say, we need to see more of this enforcement. Otherwise, you need to see more of these guys sort of sat in prison saying, well, it didn't work for me. Because at the moment, as I say, you've got the hackers seem to be very often getting away scot-free compared to others who carry out significantly lower value crime, who are then filling up the judicial and prison system.
Exactly. And so that was our last story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar. Anson Evaluate have a lot of guidance on their website, as well as training in regards to cybersecurity. Included in this, in the next few weeks, I'll be running some CPD courses, and I'll pass over to Peter to kind of talk about this in further detail.
Yes, so we're doing a series of 10 webinars of 1 hour each, so 10 hours worth of content. 4 of them are on cybersecurity, 4 are on data protection, and 2 are going to be on social media law. If you go along to both the Anson Evaluate and Digital Law websites, you will see details in terms of the timing of the first of these webinars, along with information where you can then register. And we're doing a special discount for listeners of this webinar, listeners to our podcast and our viewers on YouTube. So if you are listening to this today, you can get the special discounted rate of £300 for the whole course. Now, given that one of these webinars is £45, so therefore the whole series is £450, we're giving a massive discount to those of you who are our regular listeners. So if you drop us an email and say, hello, I'm a listener of the podcast, and can I please register for the £300 for the whole course, you can then have a special discount code which will allow you to book for the discounted rate online and register for the webinars. So please do feel free to take us up on that offer. If you are a regular listener to these discussions, I think you will enjoy the webinars, because we'll be going in real detail into some of these sorts of issues. And the first webinar is all about ransomware. So we'll be going into ransomware in a real significant amount of detail, and we'll have some real interesting case studies to share with you.
So that's it from Peter from the CPD, but Anson Evaluate will also be in partnership with TonicWorks. We'll be offering a 3-week course called Automate It. So this course will introduce a platform called DocAssemble, which can be used to create your own law tech. This course will be starting from the 30th of November, and if you would like more details, please head over to the Anson Evaluate webpage for any more details, or if not, please do not hesitate to drop us a line on admin@ansonevaluate.com. So thank you to Anson Evaluate again. We'll be back next week with hopefully another episode. And just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.